My name is Suzanne Hart, and I am sitting down with Brother Bedford, and our conversation is mistakes people make about race and economics. This is Unstoppable Mindset. For those of you who have been with us through this journey, we have experienced a little bit of technical difficulty, so I want to thank you for your patience and your commitment. But what we decided was this conversation is far too important not to have it fully land, and for you guys to glean the content and the knowledge that Brother Bedford is dropping. So the question that we've been working through and kind of talking about, and I'm gonna give Brother Bedford an opportunity to recap, and then we'll jump right back into the conversation, was, we often attribute great success and great economic success to one group of people. And then we don't attribute great success to another group. And the group, because it's Black History Month that we're talking about, is Blacks and whites, right? Mm-hmm. And the question I was asking is, why do we do that? So just to recap and situate the audience, Brother Bedford, why don't you just give that little summary, and then we'll jump right back into the conversation.
Sure. I think the first part, when we said, why do we do that? I think it's this reality that we wrestle with on a daily basis of how wealth and economics runs in this country. The actual foundation of this country created this chasm or this gap between the races that has never really been corrected. And the only way that situation can be corrected is what we talked about from Carter G. Woodson's book, when he talked about the miseducation of the Negro. We need a true education, right? We need to be completely re-educated, not just Black people. As you've touched on earlier in our conversation before we had the technical difficulties, is that the way that the system is designed, the economic system, it has impacted everyone, including whites. And so you have this classism even amongst the whites that have developed. But the only thing that would stop that, the only thing that would close these wealth gaps, the only thing that would bring everything to parity is true education about economics and race. And unfortunately, that's as we started off, that's a subject that even just to approach it has this explosiveness to it that we never really get to the root or the heart of the matter, which if we did, we could begin to correct a lot of the ills that we see.
Absolutely. One of the lives that we did 2 weeks ago was the question of, why do the words race, power, and privilege drive people crazy? We go to our perspective corners, and because it's a topic that we need to discuss. Yeah. But it comes with so much emotions, shame, blame, guilt, judgment, the whole gamut that we avoided. Now, one of the things I really want to highlight that you said is that you talked about the miseducation of the Negro in terms of the book, but there's also, as we see it, a miseducation of all of us, of white people as well.
Absolutely.
Because when I begin to collapse race and economics, and I assume that because someone looks a certain way, that has to be their status in life, that is also my own conditioning as no matter what group. So where do we begin?
Well, I think we've been touching on it, but the reality is there has to be some truth tellers. I think when you see the conditions that have happened since the beginning of 2020, and then you can see the cascading effect. It wasn't just the pandemic and businesses being closed, but even in the midst of that, we saw murders being committed, being filmed, and all of this ties into each other because this violence and all of these maladies that are happening in, again, not just the Black community, it's largely highlighted there, but it is an issue across the board. But no one really wants to tell the truth about corporate structure or economic structure. We said earlier before the technical difficulties that one of the reasons that we have this headbutting that happens, especially in our community, is that we're talking about two different things. One person may be talking about how we should be doing something and they're dealing with microeconomics. They're just dealing with a small segment, or even just their personal finances. You hear people talking about, you're not into Bitcoin, you're not into creating wealth, and that has nothing to do with the big picture of economics. That I think, again, it's something that is not taught. There's only a small few who really gravitate towards the subject. Because until we begin to have that conversation, Dr. George C. Fraser, we've mentioned him several times. He loves to quote studies, New England studies, that highlight the racial disparity in terms of income and wealth gap. And according to these studies, and this was prior to the pandemic, according to these studies, by the year 2030, 2035, Black people would have zero wealth, or the gap would be so large. And I'm quoting George now, that we would have worked our way into a second slavery, right? So, and he says, if nothing changes, well, something has changed, right? Something traumatic has happened that has really shortened or condensed this time frame. So all of these things that we were talking about in terms of artificial intelligence and replacing jobs and all of these different things happening 10, 15 years from now, those things have been pulled right to our doorstep. And so now in 2020, 2021, we're looking at a myriad of issues that the only way to solve these issues, it's like any relationship, when it's about to explode, somebody got to start telling some truth.
Absolutely.
Right? Or else is, but ego, pride, all of these things prohibit us from having an honest conversation about economics and race. And I think we have to start doing that. It's happening, but again, it causes so much angst, it causes so much anxiety and stress that it's hard to really dig deep. And I was once taught, if you want to kill a tree, you have to expose its roots.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the challenge. We'll go only so far. And so we'll put Band-Aids on these issues, or we'll try to, cover it over with something nice and talk about future possibilities and opportunities. But yet it never really materializes. And this is why we keep having this combustive relationship. And I think, we have to have some truth tellers, and it begins with conversations like this, and hopefully it begins to spread to others.
And, I love the whole concept of education that you alluded to, and education in terms of the structure of education. And one of the things that I began to understand because of some of my mentors when I was really young was that, education, I call it the status quo situation, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I love to observe and watch things. So one of the things I soon noticed was that certain people go to work and certain people build businesses. Right. And what I began to realize was the one thing that isn't taught in my educational system was wealth management and the need to build a business. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I began to realize was that, so the education system might be designed to have me fill a widget, right? Absolutely. So in other words, we had an assembly line of positions that needed to be filled in other people's businesses, i.e. the haves, then my job is to get educated, have a pre-planned position that I'm required to fill, and go to work in that. Someone determines my worth. Yes. Someone determines how long I should work, and then someone actually has determined my value.
Absolutely.
And when I began to understand that, I was like, so the system is built to maintain this. Absolutely. And the fact that we aren't educated to understand this, actually what most people don't realize is it maintains status quo.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the places to start. But then let's talk about for a moment, we were talking about conditioning, and I want you to go back to the story about if the conditioning that happened in slavery, because I want to layer the two for a moment. Right. So if I'm conditioned to think this is who I am, and then I'm put into a system, can you talk a little bit about those two?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned the educational system because that really lends itself to the current conditioning. Prior to the early 1900s, before the educational system started. And I'm glad you're highlighting these things, because what happens is most people think that what we are part of has been something that is from, the very beginning of time. And it's not. A lot of these systems that we're talking about is barely 100 years old. So it's all been in testing phase. Right. So now there's a reality that we have to say, okay, this doesn't work. This education does not work for this group of people. So the people who literally set up the educational system, the industrialists that financed all of the current education system that we had, they created a curriculum and a system to create workers. Right. Mm-hmm. So you are absolutely correct. So the educational system was created to produce workers who had their limits, or the limitations that they saw for themselves was to go work. I mean, I'm not an old man, but I'm not a young man either. But I remember growing up, and the only things that we were told was to go to school, get good grades, so you get a job. And being from Detroit, Michigan, the three best jobs were, the two best jobs were, well, it was three. It was the automotive industry. And then there was all of the subsidiary businesses that supported the automotive industry, and then the post office. And so you literally had people who were not the most educated, able to live a middle-class lifestyle. Mm-hmm. They could literally come out of school functionally illiterate and go and work on the line and still be able to afford a house in the suburbs, 2-car garage, and have, chicken dinners every Sunday and everybody come over. So as technology and everything is advanced, that type of education isn't sufficient. We broke out of that scenario when globalization took over. And so now that low wage labor, or that labor, was replaced by overseas labor or labor down south of the border, and all of these different things. And so back to your point, so the educational system that conditioned us, that Carter G. Woodson talked about, the indoctrination, we've never broken that. Now, here's the consequence of that, though, is that we're witnessing today education imploding on itself, right? So now we're watching people who do not love this educational system. And in fact, it has become a money grab, right? So it's student debt. I mean, we could have a whole nother show talking about student debt and how this is a big debate right now. So prior to that education, though, in the early 1900s of this system, it's important to know that Black people were the skilled labor. So again, this is the truth that has to be told. So there were some things done that after, when we start talking about Reconstruction, and after Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, and we were so-called free, after that, people don't realize that Black people went and built over 60 towns because we were the labor. Remember, we were the slaves that built the White House, the Capitol building. So white people were not skilled like that. But once Reconstruction happened, that era happened, now this is where the unions and all of these things came into play to kind of squeeze us out, because now we were the skilled people, but now you had white people who used to be the overseers and things like that. Now they were no longer employable, or they didn't have a job. So they got into the trades, and this is where the union, so for a long time, and this is just, I think this is great education for people to go and study this, is that for a long time, the relationship in the unions with Black people and white people during that time was terrible. And so again, we were conditioned to only seek a job, and then the jobs that we could get, we were in heavy competition with, now you had the whites of this country, and then immigrants who started coming to this country for a better life. And so that left us in a very, very tight position. And so now, fast forward to today, when you say we have these conversations, it's only a few of us, like us, having this conversation, and those who are smart enough to tune in and listen to you, to begin to understand this subject matter and these topics, that you need to go outside of the traditional education and get involved in lifelong learning and self-education. Absolutely. to do the things that we're doing, right? To learn the skills and things to build business and entrepreneurship. But that's just not the norm. So that's why we're having this conversation.
It so is. And then let's compound that. So we have a shift as we become more industrialized. But then we also combine that with a mindset of our placement in society.
Yes.
We know that when shifts happen on the economic front, race becomes the definer in terms of people don't get so nice. Let's just be real.
Absolutely.
Right. And so what ends up happening is you have this preconditioned situation of I should have and you shouldn't have.
Yes.
I'm entitled and you're not. I should be the overseer and you're not. And when economics gets tight, that elevates and people begin to act on those dynamics.
Absolutely.
So what we see, and I think what we saw a lot in 2020, and I'd love for you to comment on this, is that, things got, we got nervous. Mm-hmm. We got, people became afraid. People were worried about their financial situations, and boom, race becomes a heated situation because conditioning says, I need to be in the situation and you're taking what's mine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, nature kicks in.
Right.
That's what happens. The first law of nature, self-preservation, kicks in. So after all of the smoke and mirrors are moved, right? After all of the things that make everything all right, that you have a lot of investors say a rising tide lifts all boats, right? But then what happens is when all of the water is sucked out, now what happens? Now you have everybody surviving. And I think what 2020 did was it began to expose all of the cracks in this society. I believe Condoleezza Rice said that this nation was born with a birth defect. And she talked about how this defect had began to become cancerous. And so now we're living in a time where what she called a birth defect at the beginning or the establishment of this nation, now here we are in 2020, and that small tumor has become a cancer, and now it has caused the entire American body to suffer pain. Mm-hmm. And now, how do we cure this cancer that we have that causes this separation and cause these clashes? And again, it goes back to something very fundamental, and you've said it. It's education and truth. But if you are of the mindset that you're superior, and if there's a truth on education that elevates me to the same level, you may have an issue with that, right? Yeah. And vice versa. So here we are, we have a group of people who have an inferiority complex, and then you have a group of people who have a superiority complex. But now you have the laws of the universe rendering everyone equal, and we're not equipped to handle that. And that goes back to what you were talking about, the mindset. We don't know how to handle it.
That is so well said. And one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is because we don't know how to handle it. And as a result, there is almost this vying for, I joke all the time because when I used to drive to the US, of course, I crossed the border and I would get stopped and me and my little Mercedes would get asked some really weird questions.
Right.
And I know the questioning came from, I don't fit the picture of someone who should have this success and this amount of freedom.
Right.
Right. And people would say, well, why does it irk you? It irks me because until everyone sees me as having it possible, my race is not, it's a representation of how they see people who look like me.
Correct.
So it's not just Suzanne got stopped. It was Suzanne got stopped because the people who look like her should not be in that car.
Absolutely.
Unless I'm doing something illegal.
Absolutely.
And so we have this conditioning that is constantly there. And so my question becomes, what do we do to start? Like what? And I love to have like all the questions that all the lives we've had I believe that there's responsibilities on our part, and there's responsibility on, and I talk about my white friends who want to be proactive, and they're saying, Suzanne, I see it. And they're saying, I see my conditioning. I see, what do I do?
Yeah. It's such a profound question, because the sacrifices that would need to be made on those who see it, the question, probably not immediately, but at some point it would come up, what are you prepared to sacrifice?
Yeah.
What are you prepared to give up? If you know that the playing field is so uneven and you know you're sitting on privilege, what are you prepared to do to bring the scales of justice back to balance? And I think so in reality, a lot of people like to theorize about what would be the solution. But this is going to be a very tough pill to swallow. The reason the last administration, and I know a lot of people like to blame so much on him, even today, you have to realize that there are literally tens of millions of people who believe that he is right and believe that idea. And so I used to use the analogy that, back in the day, again, my parents, they were from Tennessee. So they used to talk about when you had a boil, you put salt pork on it and it would bring the poison to the top and then the boil would bust. I always likened Donald Trump to the salt pork, right? He would bring the poison to the top and it just busts. So that body of people believe that they lost so much and they sacrificed so much, right? So I see Susan in a Mercedes. She shouldn't have that. That should be mine. So I've already sacrificed my life to make sure that everyone else, but yet they don't feel that they're getting the American dream anymore. And so now so it goes back to our earlier point. So you have a large segment of the people who literally blame us because you may see a Jay-Z or Beyonce, and then it's like, so what are you all complaining about? They can point out a few athletes and entertainers who have broken through and achieved great wealth, right? Great sums of wealth. And then automatically they feel that they've already given enough. And again, that's why I say this true picture of what the masses of Black people go through, and not just Black people. We haven't even scratched the surface of talking about the natives, Native Americans, and the challenges, or the Hispanics and Latino community. So I mean, there's just a lot of things that have happened that the only thing that's going to solve this, and I agree with you totally, there has to be this truth that renders us all equal, and it's going to be painful for us to look at each other and without blame, without finger pointing, without revenge. I used to hear, when Malcolm X used to teach, they used to say that one of the reasons that white people were so afraid that if Black people got into power, that we would do the same thing to them that they have done to us. But if you just really analyze us, it's just not in our nature. It's not in our heart. In fact, we don't even think about that. As you mentioned, so even when you and I are having this conversation, we're trying to have a colorblind conversation about changing mindset.
Absolutely. And
other people can't see that.
And it's funny because I'm reading Black Theology, Black Power, and rereading it. It's like my all-time favorite read. Right. That's like a book.
Yes.
And one of the things that it speaks to so powerfully is that Black people aren't fighting for superiority. The Black people are fighting for their humanity.
Isn't that something?
Right? To be seen as humans that have rights.
Yeah.
And so we're not fighting to be seen as superior to anyone. We just want to be seen as people who have human rights and human dignity, and we have a opportunity to fully self-actualize and determine what our life should and can look like. And that's a different thing. And I think, you know, for me, when you are caught in that power struggle,
Yeah.
and you feel superior, it's natural to think that people want if someone gets in power, that's exactly, you know, they're going to do that. That's what they must want. Not necessarily. Now, I do believe that, you know, I'm big on understanding the dynamics of power, because I do believe that positional power, people, we can't abuse it. But on the bigger scale, that's not what we're after. We're after our own humanity. But I think also that when we talk about economics, you know, I find these conversations so fascinating, because the crazy thing about economics is there are the haves and there's the have-nots.
Right.
And I always love the conversation of the divide and conquer, right? So divide the groups, and we have all these groups that don't have access, fighting for a little bit of access, not understanding the name of the game. And so the natural thing is to have us point at each other. You took my job. You're driving my Mercedes. You're driving the thing. And I love the fact that you go back to understanding economics, because if we truly understand economics as the masses, we would understand that none of us took anything from anyone.
Absolutely.
Right? None of us, I didn't take your job, you didn't take mine. There is abundance. It's the problem is we don't understand how the abundance game is played. So we're playing a game over here. This is the masses. And then we have 10% or 3% playing a totally different game. And no one's educating us about the rules of that game over there. So we're fighting and finger pointing, right? Compound with racism and wanting to access here and not realizing, well, that's a totally different game, and it has nothing to do with us over here. And so it's deep.
It is. It is. It's truly deep. And it's something that you just mentioned about economics. And it's funny, if you notice, the nature of us, and I'm speaking of Black people, if you notice, we take it to a higher level. So when you start, see, even the language. So if you think about it, most people are having this discussion and this argument through a political type of language, a political lens. But when we begin to have the conversation, we kind of take it to a spiritual level, right? And so we believe in abundance, right? So who's the master economist, right? God is the master economist. Nothing goes to waste. But in this society, up under European rugged individualism, things go to waste. There's no need for people to go hungry or to starve. But yet, based upon that dynamic that I must control, or I must have the power, or I dictate what you eat, what you drive, it has really corrupted the entire conversation. So when we said earlier, I think we're just having, especially amongst our people, we're talking, we can say economics, but we're really talking on 2 to 3 different levels. And I just love the way that you framed that, because at the root of it, that's the type of conversation we really want to have. We don't want to take anything from anyone. We just want to find out, how can I access what is already in abundance? And that's a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, and to access what is already in abundance with no consequence.
That's right.
Right, with absolutely no consequence. You know, we need to continue these conversations.
Absolutely.
For sure, because you know, when I saw marches happen this summer, and I saw all the things that were occurring, one of the things I said to my friends, many of my white friends, I said, to march is one thing, right? To march is like a statement, but it's not a changer. And then when I saw the upset about privilege, I was like, until we understand privilege, because in order for equity to happen, there's as you said, there's that equalizer, and privilege will be lost. Right? And so, but this is the interesting thing. Privilege that comes from external factors, you always fear losing it. And this is why I do mindset, right? I love mindset work because privilege that comes from internal factors in terms of I know who I am. Yeah. I believe in who I am. I understand my history. I understand my destiny. Yeah. I understand that I'm equal to anyone else, whether they believe it or not. When privilege comes from this place, I now know I can have privilege, you can have privilege, and you take nothing from me.
Absolutely.
But when privilege is either unearned or a product of positional power, one must hold it because it's not from in you.
Absolutely.
And so for me, one of the conversations that I love mindset is about is mindset is about cultivating, as you said, and drawing out and educating so people find the brilliance and the capacity that lives within them so that they don't have to depend on privilege and oppression and marginalization and excluding and fighting for the same thing because they think that's what it is. And they begin to understand that I have equal power as Brother Bedford.
Absolutely.
I have equal resources within me as Brother Bedford. And privilege is a true privilege, and true power is an internal thing.
Yeah.
And I joke with people, I go, external is just force.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not power.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing that you just said that I want to, we started talking about this, and I do want to get this in before we close out, because it dovetails right back into the education. Because again, this is the same education that even white people were taught, right? So again, they were taught about greatness and conquering and all of those different things. And again, they saw themselves. We didn't see ourselves in that education, right? And so that's a struggle in and of itself. But that mindset that you're speaking of, that concept, that construct comes from individualism to where there's no collaboration. And what is happening, and this is important, I think, for those of us, and George is really, he knocked the ball out of the park with this thing about effective relationships, right? This is what it's all about, because when you really boil it down, and when you really go to that highest level of understanding, we're supposed to be connecting and collaborating. So if that's the spirit, if that's the energy, if that's the thought processes, I'm not looking at you taking anything from me, right? As you mentioned, that privilege is coming from the outside. I know that if I'm developing myself and Susan is developing herself, we don't compete, we collaborate, right? We come together. That's a totally different mind. And we know that there is no, I'm going to get more than you, or you're going to get more than, whatever happens. Both of our cups get filled, and whatever spills over, we're satisfied with whatever comes from that collaboration. And that is going to be a mental barrier that we have to break through, because most people are still, I can't say that it's not warranted, right? It's the training, it's the education. We still think that in order for you to have, I must be giving up something.
Absolutely.
And that's a challenge.
Absolutely. And so this is a challenge I'm putting out, and I've invited all my friends to play this game, is that, Turi and I collaborate, and we were in the spirit of collaboration, because we know that when we come together, we are more. We create more, we have more capacity, because we both bring our brilliance to the table. And so as I sat down and I chose to do this conversation, I went to Black friends and I went to white friends, and I said, I'm going to engage in this conversation.
Sure.
Part of it scares me because it's a conversation that's not popular, but I'm going to have it, and I'm going to challenge you to collaborate with me, because you're going to learn, I'm going to learn. But this is the thing. The beginning for me is modeling what I desire to see, to model collaboration. The beginning to me is to be willing to cross over and sit down with my white friend and say, let's talk about this race and economics thing. Let's talk about this thing. How do we collaborate so we both win? Because I know for myself, it's all of us, systems take time.
Yeah.
But personal responsibility means I shift here. Yeah. I go work with a Brother Bedford who's going to show me teach me economics and set me up. And I think, we tend to play the waiting game. And what frustrated me last year was even when President Obama was running, it was he's going to change things. He's going to save us. He's going to do all this.
Yeah.
And my thing was, where are we, the individual,
That's right.
in the collective conversation? So the challenge is for people like you and I to continue to have conversations, but also for those who are sitting on the peripheral to have the courage to join the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And go and get educated. The one thing that I love about our conversations that we have, and a lot of it is deliberate. You know, we mention names of books and authors because you can't really begin to apply these things if you don't go and do some investigation yourself, go and do some study. And that's why I said truth, once it's laid on the table, again, it may be painful to begin with, but over time, healing takes place. So I would encourage, in order to join this challenge, as you already mentioned, I would say go out and study these things that we talked about. Look at the educational system and how it started and all. And so then it won't, so when I say it, maybe you won't be pointing at me saying, oh, he an old radical, he coming, where he get that stuff from? No, just study it. And then we can have a conversation as to how to fix it. And so to you, Susan, I tip my hat because I know you have a desire to have this conversation, but it's more than that. This is critical. This conversation has to be had, and the seeds. I think the best part about our work, and I'm growing to learn this as well. You and I don't have to accomplish everything.
Yeah.
But if we can plant the seed so that seed goes and it begins to do the work in its own sphere of influence, then we're doing our job. Because again, we're collaborating, but you and I can't do it all. George can't do it all. So we have to do the work, plant the seeds. And this conversation in this environment is so important. So that's why when you asked me, I jumped at the opportunity, because it's not like the winds of change, are not happening. It's not like this is going to go away. Yeah. So how do we deal with this? We can't keep getting mad. We can't keep getting angry. We can't keep closing the doors and putting our fingers in our ears and having tantrums. We have to begin to mature as human beings and begin to have intelligent conversations on how we're going to solve this issue between Black and white, rich and poor, have and have nots. Because if not, 2020 was just the beginning.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we want to try to change that. We'd better get busy. So I applaud you for doing this.
And, I think, when you said that, Donald Trump was she was like the catalyst for all of this. And we may not like the catalyst. The catalyst sometimes can be good.
Absolutely.
Right. And sometimes, when I did crisis work, there's this thing called, you go create a crisis to cause healing.
Right.
So you go stir up stuff and you create the catastrophic moment that no one wants to see happen.
That's right.
So that healing can happen. And so, I think in many ways we were living in this illusion that all was kind of well. Absolutely. And all was going perfectly. Absolutely. And there was progress. And then Donald Suckhant came and said, we're just going to pull some stuff to the surface so you can see what's really going on.
Yeah.
And as much as we don't like it, blessings come in the oddest ways.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because truth is now all over the place, and maybe we don't like it, but it is.
Absolutely.
And the part of the reason, I think we do this work, I know for myself, when I graduated from university with all my education, and I say that underlined, and I went and I sat with my first supervisors, and I had 4 of them, totally blessed. African studies, urban studies, social services with an African focus,
right,
and social services with an African surface in the legal. So that was how I was supervised.
Right.
4 years, I sat at the feet of these amazing people for 4 hours once a week.
Right.
And my life changed in those 4 years. Then, of course, I meet people like George. I meet people like you. And so part of the courage and the need to have this conversation is I have a responsibility.
Absolutely. Because
someone put the conversation in the space and it changed my life.
Right.
and let me see that opportunity and difference was available to me.
Absolutely.
And so one of the things I want to commend you for is being part of this conversation, because you're planting the seed that will change some lives, that hope, and I will trust that they will do the same thing and say, I'm obligated to pass on the work of a George C. Fraser, a Sherry Elder, who was my supervisor, a Joy LaPage, a white woman who, like, could you just take a stance, right?
Right, I love it.
And they risked, and they risked a lot for my education and my knowing. And I know George is risking, you're risking, so that's why we do it.
Yeah.
So
it's love. Once you do it, you fall in love with the work or the people. I mean, there's really no other explanation. In fact, you can't do this type of work if you don't love it. It's going to wear you out. You will tap out and you'll do something else, because it is such a long, arduous journey to do this work, and a lot of pain, because you probably witnessed it more so than a lot of people. When you're doing social work, you're on the front lines and you're seeing the ramifications of all of these things in families, real human beings. And so again, that's what kind of ignites us to do what we do. And we see the ramifications. Sometimes when people meet us, we're you think that this is the norm, or this is the way that it normally is. But then we know that once we go outside of the walls of Power Networking Conference and all of these different things, we know the condition that a lot of our people, and again, really just America now, the condition of America, and we dive into the work. So again, I thank you so much for including me.
Oh, I have been sitting down with the one and only Brother Bedford, one of my favorite interviews every single time. And I want to leave everyone with this thought. I often close with, please know you're special, please know you're brilliant, and the world is waiting for you to put your unique gifts into the marketplace. But I also want to add that freedom is here, right? And the one thing that, I don't want to say education, but access to consciousness gave me, was that it freed me here. And once you're free here, things that seemed impossible become possible. Things that you didn't see as your responsibility become your responsibility. And that's where that unstoppable mindset lives, right? Where you bring the challenge, I got this. And it starts with the mindset here. So blessings. Thank you for joining us. We will be back here next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And each Thursday, we will be having a provocative, inclusive leadership conversation, because I truly believe that this is a leadership responsibility, right? I don't want to do the race relation diversity thing, because people exclude themselves from the conversation. But if you're a leader in this time, this is a conversation we are responsible and must have. So take care, blessings, and I will see you back here next week.